Welcome to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Welcome, everyone, to Et al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm Anna Kate, your host, and today we have with us a group of authors and contributors and editors who are excited to share about their book. We have Dr. David Jasper, is Professor Emeritus of Literature and Theology at the University of Glasgow, and the former Zhang, visiting professor at Renmin University. He is the co-editor of our work for today, Between Different Cultures, Essays in Conversation with Yang Huilin. We're also joined by his co-editor, Dr. Jing, who is the associate researcher at the Institute for the Promotion of Chinese Language and Culture at Renmin University. We also have today with us two of our contributors to the volume, Dr. Andrew Haas, who is a reader in the religion at the University of Stirling and a founding member of the Critical Religion Association and the International Society for Religion, Literature, and Culture. He is a contributing author on this work, and also Dr. Chloë Starr, who is the professor of Asian Christianity and Theology at Yale Divinity School, who has also contributed to this volume. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have with us these editors and these contributors to this volume. And in the introduction to this work, Between Different Cultures, Dr. Zhang and Dr. Jasper write that Huilin Yang is, quote, one of the most significant scholars within the study of religion and the humanities at the present time, not only within China, but across the world, close quote. Why is this? Can you guys tell us a little bit about what the key areas of influence of his work are?
Professor Yang Huilin has three key areas, we normally say. One is the comparative literature. He's a scholar of Shakespeare, so he teaches Western literature, we call it, in Chinese universities. And also, he wrote a book about the history of medieval literature. So that's one area that's he made a great impact, because his way of doing Shakespeare is different from other Shakespearean scholars. And also the second area is the scriptural reasoning. He is the first scholar. He was invited by the Lambeth Palace for a meeting where he heard from Professor David Ford about this concept, scriptural reasoning. Then he brought it back to China. And also, for scriptural reasoning, originally it was a kind of very religious among the Hebrew, about the Abrahamic religions. But he thinks that in the commentaries of the translation of James Legge, of Chinese traditional texts or classical texts, you can find scriptural reasoning, something similar. So Professor Yang actually enlarged the concept of or definition of scriptural reasoning, and also in his dialogue with David Ford and Peter Oakes, actually he is changing their understanding of scriptural reasoning and making scriptural reasoning develop in a different way in China. I mean, not very religious, but among the scholars or secular dialogues, more on the ideas. Yeah, so in this book, you will find a chapter by Professor Ford on the scriptural reasoning. There, he has more to say. Yeah, so, and his third area is Sino-Christianity, where Professor Jasper may say more.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Sino-Christian theology is an exciting development in Christian theology, primarily emanating from the academies and universities of China. And Professor Yang Huilin has been one of the major both writers and speakers on Sino-Christian theology, which of course is rooted in a different philosophical tradition from Western Christian theology, has its own quite distinctive patterns of thought. And in his tireless traveling to North America and to Europe, Professor Yang has been one of the major influences in bringing our attention to this important development in Christian thinking in our present time.
Wonderful. And I'd love to invite the contributors in on this conversation. Dr. Haas, you say in your chapter that this then is how we ought to envision a new theology, a return to religion in theology, and at the same time, a return to theology in religion. So kind of taking from what Dr. Zhang and Dr. Jasper have given us, what do you mean by this, and how do Zhang and Derrida contribute to and explain this return?
Yes, so the idea of a Sino-Christian theology was still sort of heavily weighted with a Western sense of thinking, of concepts, and indeed of a kind of Christian model. You could argue that Sino-Christian theology came out of a kind of Oxfordian or English sense in the 19th century, and has really sort of retained some of the strong Western presuppositions, we might say, about what either constitutes theology or what either constitutes religion. And I think what Professor Yang has been trying to do is open up the whole understanding of theology per se. Theology is not a category that you will find in any Chinese academic context. And therefore you have to ask, well, how would a Chinese person go about studying that in China? And it would have to do it through different avenues, different disciplines, different labels. And I think what he was trying to do is open up an understanding of theology that wasn't restricted to simply Christian thinking and Christian paradigms. And so his understanding of theology needed to come together with a wider understanding of religion. That what we do under the name of either a theology or a religion can be compatible with the kind of thinking that goes on within a Chinese context, whether that's an academic context or even indeed a social and communal context. So bringing theology into religion or religion into theology, I think, is Professor Yang's way of expanding the dialogue to be far more inclusive beyond just the categories that were inherited in the original framing of Sino-Christian theology.
And it seems like that's a lot of what Professor Yang was after, was really just bringing context to the ideas of religion and theology and how one can kind of combine those together in a Chinese context, even though they might have been sort of Western ideas, but kind of bringing them into a context where they make sense to the proponents of any certain religion. So that's really important. You quote as a definition for theology, and so can you make for us the distinction between theology and theology?
Yes. Now, these are very sort of specific terms that was put forward originally by the philosopher Martin Heidegger and is picked up by Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, and engaged with by Professor Yang as a way of doing exactly what I was just suggesting. Opening up the term and the concept of theology to something much broader. So theology, as it's been inherited, is usually something quite specific to the nature of God as it is seen within either a Jewish or a Christian monotheism. And those categories of divinity have remained very defining in the sense of what does it mean to talk about a God. But Heidegger thought, well, if there's a way of talking not about the specifics of that character, but about the nature of godness itself, then we might be able to expand our conversation and our dialogue beyond culturally specific terms. So teleology, as Heidegger and then Derrida picks up, was a way of thinking about the notion of divinity, which wouldn't restrict it simply to cultural traditions and paradigms of one kind. That we can all, from whatever tradition we come from, talk about the nature of godness, whether that is within a kind of Confucian context or was within a polytheistic or a monotheistic context, etc. So the terms there are very technical in one sense, but on the other hand, open up for us possibilities of cross-fertilizing our conversations across the East and the West, which is really at the heart of the book that we're discussing.
Yeah, it reminds me too of Acts 17 when Paul makes the comment about the unknown God and how he kind of brings in a religious context that already existed into the religion and the gospel that he was preaching. And so it seems like that's part of what Professor Yang was doing, was almost moving the terms into a way that applied more appropriately to the context with which he was dealing. So that's really helpful. Thank you, Dr. Haas. Dr. Starr, your chapter is called Musing on Missionary Identity. And in it, you echo Professor Yang in saying that texts continue, in some sense, the life of the person, and that the individual may be known through their writings. So I wonder if you could help us understand, what role do writings play in the identity formation of a missionary?
Thank you for that question. So in this article that I'm responding to, Professor Yang suggests that identity is both a noun and a verb, being and becoming, or identity and ascription, what somebody's recognized as. And in the Chinese tradition, a person's writings were always seen as an extension of the self, with the authorial identity visible in the words, through the words, or in the famous case of Sima Qian, akin to one's own progeny. The historian Sima Qian was willing to suffer the indignities of castration in order to write so that his works would be his legacy. And so when the Protestant missionaries came to China in the 19th century, they discovered not only a culture of valorizing texts and printed works, but a whole new worldview shaped by a particular set of classics and commentaries, in a system where state and authority were bound to those texts. And James Legge was one of the missionaries that Professor Yang Huilin has worked on quite extensively, but also who was formed as a missionary by those Chinese writings. And he himself said he didn't really become a missionary till the very end of his life, because only at that point he had a deeper knowledge of the Chinese classical texts. Now, many of the early missionaries spent a good deal of their time translating. Robert Morrison, for example, produced a dictionary and a grammar and numerous pedagogical texts that other missionaries later used. But translation wasn't really valorized. Even when they were translating Bibles, it was seen as important and necessary, but what they were really supposed to be doing was doing their missionary work of going out and teaching and preaching. And Professor Yang, in his article, talks about this vacillating identity between translator and missionary, between sinologist and missionary. But I think if we read Legge carefully, we see much more of an integrated identity. And I think I would argue that he saw his translation work, and especially his deep reading in the Chinese classics, as part of his missionary identity, because he couldn't really understand God in China, God in the Chinese people, until he had read and digested and thoroughly understood, as best he could, those Chinese classics. And later, of course, he's seen by many people as a missionary to his own people, because he translated the early Confucian Chinese classics into English. But I think in one sense we could also see him as a missionary to China, because the method he used of working between Chinese texts and English language texts, of doing that work of translating, became a basis for thinking about a contextual theology in the 20th century, a sort of Asian or Chinese Christian theological method and methodology. So I think that Professor Yang is right to raise up missionary writers and thinkers like James Legge as important. And since he did that quite early on, loads of students have taken up this work and worked on James Legge, but mainly either worked on criticizing his translations or worked on him as a sinologist. And relatively few people have thought about him actually as a missionary and how those Chinese texts informed his view and expanded his understanding of God.
Sure. Thank you for that. And I think, too, that any translation is, in a sense, interpretation, because you're kind of rendering the words in a way that makes the most sense in the language that you're bringing it to. And so, in some ways, that contextualization really is, as you're saying, and as Professor Yang has said, it is mission work, and it's bringing and communicating in a way that can be best understood and best internalized by someone that is native to that language. So that's really helpful. Thank you, Dr. Starr. So Professor Yang lives in an interdisciplinary space, and in many ways, so do the four of you. And so I'm wondering, in what ways have other disciplines shaped each of your personal understanding of theology?
Well, perhaps if I could begin to answer that question.
Sure.
I suppose that for most of us here, we would broadly describe literature and religion, or perhaps literature and theology, as the interdiscipline. And certainly Professor Yang, as a professor of comparative literature, is an exponent of that. We've heard already that he's a Shakespeare scholar. But of course, reading Shakespeare in a Chinese context is rather different from reading it in a British or an American context for all sorts of reasons. And one of the necessary consequences of interdisciplinarity is that it takes you out of your safety zone. And Professor Yang has, as scholar, been very good at helping us to kind of move beyond our safety zones as scholars. And I certainly found that myself working in China, that that opened up a whole world of texts. Chloe's mentioned the Chinese classics, and these, I think, through the work of Professor Yang particularly, have reached a far wider audience, but also in the context of other literature, other world literature, as well as theology and philosophy. And so the disciplines begin to sort of, as it were, accumulate. And I hope what our book has been able to do is to bring together a group of American and European and one Australian scholars who are all in conversations of one kind or another with Professor Yang's work. We deliberately decided to structure the book in this way so that the book is not only interdisciplinary, but it's also deeply intercultural. And the way cultures have to learn to speak to one another and learn from one another in difficult ways through literature, through religious texts, through philosophy, and so on and so forth. And one of the essays that I think represents the genius of Professor Yang is that by Professor Jürgen Moltmann, who is, of course, sadly now no longer with us. But I think I'm right in saying that this is probably the last English piece that has been published by Professor Moltmann after a very long tour. And I met Professor Moltmann through Professor Yang in Beijing, not in Germany, but Beijing and Renmin University became this kind of extraordinary meeting place of different scholars and different cultures and different disciplines. As far as such distinguished people as Professor Jürgen Moltmann, and that was enabled by Professor Yang.
I think, so like what David has said, the Shakespeare, we read Shakespeare differently in China. It's because we suppose we forget Shakespeare as a Christian, or so we ignore all the Christian context of Shakespeare's works. We may know a little bit about this history, but we're just charmed by the language and the story, and it seems fine. You can read it and you enjoy it, but Professor Young brings in brings it back, the theology. So you read it differently, and you can understand the conflict more thoroughly. For myself, interdisciplinary should benefit my personal theology is that I was born in this multi-religious context and country. So I was raised up in Taoism, Buddhism, this and I'm the first. So how can I understand Christian theology is through the lens of Taoism. So I can find very, very close and very familiar in reading Paul, especially his, this dialectic sayings. I just, it's so Taoist, and also beautiful. So that's for me. And for this kind of closeness or affinity, then I think Christianity to me is something that I can understand more clearly or differently.
Yeah, so I work on Chinese theology, and Chinese theology can't really be understood without a good knowledge of Chinese history and culture. If we think back to the era when the Jesuits were at court in the Ming Dynasty, for example, then you need to understand Chinese philosophy and classical thought to follow the Christian debates. And you need a grasp of Buddhism, as Kathy says, at that time to make sense of Matteo Ricci's debates with scholars. In the late 20th century, Marxist thoughts and concepts have shaped the development of aspects of Chinese theology. So some sense of political science is imperative too. And in my own work, I argue that Chinese theology can't be understood without a sense of Chinese literature and literary form. And this crosses over very much with Professor Yang Huilin's work, because otherwise we might misread theology, or we look for theology in the form of an essay and we miss it elsewhere in Chinese writing. And as David says, scholars of Chinese Christianity and theology in China are not, well, primarily not in seminaries, but they work out of universities, many of them. And therefore, they aren't coming out of religious studies and theology departments for the great majority, but they're coming from all different disciplines, often situated in history or philosophy or literature departments. And so Chinese theology, academic theology, Sino-Christian theology, has certainly been shaped very deeply by a whole range of subjects and isn't situated in one in particular. So we, as readers and consumers of it, and people who engage dialogue with Chinese theology, need to have a much greater breadth of disciplinary awareness than usual, perhaps.
And if I might pick up on that, the idea of a distinction between theology and religion, as I was talking about earlier, is quite stark in the academic disciplines of the West, where religion or religious studies tends to focus more on a kind of social sciences approach, and particularly sociological and anthropological interests. Whereas theology tends to be assuming a certain belief and investment in a faith tradition first, and then working out the understanding of the divine from that point. What I think is really important in the interdisciplinary and intercultural connections is that Professor Yang has encouraged a kind of reciprocal shaping of all of those fields, so that we can't think of theology without really moving into territory that has been traditionally part of religious studies. So what is a sociology of theology, for example, or what is an anthropology of theology? Within the Chinese context, that becomes really important, as Chloë was just suggesting. You can't actually think about Chinese theology without looking at that cultural history and tradition and context. And the way that this then becomes a kind of reciprocal exercise, I think, is very, very important. As much as we may have bequeathed Karl Marx to China, China then has bequeathed a different Karl Marx back to us. And that's one example of the way in which we find mutual growth and understanding through this intercultural engagement.
Thank you all. And Dr. Zhang, I especially appreciate what you said too about viewing your own personal faith through the lens of Taoism and kind of coming to this understanding through a lens that was really natural for the context in which you grew up. And I think that's what the four of you get at in conversation with Professor Yang in this work, is that it really is about coming to faith within your context, and specifically in this Chinese context, overcoming the historical and, you talked about Shakespearean, so maybe literary barriers that kind of serve to frame Christianity in a Western context, and just really breaking down those borders and opening it up to a context that is applicable in China. And so I appreciate you guys and your feedback on that. So all of the contributors on this work, as Dr. Jasper pointed out, are European or North American context. We have one Australian who responded to Professor Yang. So if maybe you guys could speak to how Chinese theology, and specifically Dr. Yang's work, has influenced European and North American theology. So kind of to what Dr. Haas was saying before, how, it was received in China, and then how does China kind of bring it back into the North, and how is it received? And then in what ways do you hope that it will influence the North American and European theologies?
Yeah, okay. See, scholars like Professor Yang is quite rare in this world. I mean, at the age of 15, he went to the farmland to work, where he has to work as a farmer, but like a farmer. But because he plays violin, so he could stay in a art college or something to play music for the others. So his education actually stopped at age 12. So he learned English by himself, and then read all the books, Hegel and other books that's available secretly by himself. And I think so he's also well trained by himself of the Chinese classical texts. So he has read a lot and recited a lot, has very good memories. So he's well trained in both Western knowledge and also Chinese knowledge. In that way that he can dialogue in both sides. Many scholars whose English are good, but they may not understand the language in that deeper if they do not understand the ideas or the history of ideas that deeply. But he understands, and he visited Leuven, the University of Leuven, many times, stayed there doing research, and made friends with Catholic professors and also priests. So he stayed in the monastery and got up at 4 a.m. to sit in their church at the chapel and hear their beautiful songs. So that's all his fond memories of this beauty, of this heritage, of the culture. And he talks a lot about, he knows the architecture, church buildings, he knows all the Bible stories. So when he was with the other university league, going visiting this church, he's always the person to explain all the Bible stories on the screen. So, and also very uniquely, he is a person who respects others, because he has suffered, but he does not want the others to suffer the same. So he works very hard to keep this sober mind, and also to keep this right to speak the right thing. And actually, he made three Davy friends, Davy Jasper, Davy Jeffrey, and David Ford. And Professor Jeffrey, actually, first meeting with Professor Yang was in his 30s, where he said something, criticized Christianity. And it is Professor Jeffrey who stood up and argued for him. although he didn't agree with Professor Yang's idea. And that's something that how to say, marveled Professor Yang, and so he respects, or he talks a lot about this respect. He respects all the theologians who are open-minded, inclusive, and respect Chinese characteristics. So, in one sentence, is that Professor Yang is a scholar who can explain to the Western scholars the Chinese thinking of Western works in a way that they can understand. And also his way of talking about, so he's the person that can reflect your culture and make you see something new. And also he himself see others as reflections to find his own tradition, something new. That is something Professor David Ford taught about the wisdom of all civilizations.
Wow. And what a gift to be able to reflect something new, not only from your own culture and tradition, but from another culture and tradition back to people who are native to that culture and tradition. I think that's just really a talent, and what a legacy that Professor Yang has left. And we're just so grateful to have you guys in dialogue with him and in his works. And so we appreciate all of your contributions towards this book, and we are so grateful for having you guys on today and for this conversation. So thank you so much. For those listening, if you'd like to purchase their work, please go to BaylorPress.com and you can find their book there. We also want to invite you to subscribe, to comment, and to like this video so that you can keep up with the latest from et al. And Baylor University Press. So thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et al.